Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the launch of the model legislative provisions for victims of terrorism. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our partners and friends in this tripartite initiative, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and the Inter-Parliamentary Union for their strong collaboration with my office in this endeavor. And my sincere appreciation to all those who participated in developing the provisions, namely United Nations entities, civil society organizations, victims associations, and survivors of terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, the frightening cost of terrorism is starkly evident through the thousands of victims that continue to be affected by terrorist attacks. I have spoken in the past at length about the need to provide victims with recognition, justice, dignity, truth, and respect. However, translating these words into actions remains a challenge. Showing political will means supporting victims, understanding their unique needs, and realizing their rights. We owe that to the victims, their families, and their communities. This can be done by member states enacting strong domestic legislation that recognizes that victims need support and require accountability, and that establishes mechanisms that are victims-centric. The Secretary General's report on progress made by the United Nations system in supporting member states in assisting victims of terrorism, as well as relevant General Assembly resolutions, including Resolution 73/305 on enhancement of international cooperation to assist victims of terrorism, and the 7th review of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy have all urged to strengthen national efforts in protecting and supporting the rights and needs of victims, particularly through the development of strong domestic frameworks. I'm proud to be here today with Ms. Ghada Fatih Wali, Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and Mr. Martin Chungong, Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, to the launch of the model legislative provisions on victims of terrorism. Ladies and gentlemen, the model legislative provisions aim to strengthen the ability of national governments to provide victims with appropriate support both immediately after an attack and in the long term on key issues that affect victims and in response to the specific needs of women, girls, boys, and men. The provisions will serve as a model to review existing national laws and procedures related to victims of terrorism, so that they are in line with international legal frameworks on victims. They will also help fill the gap where no legislation exists. The provisions can further support the development of national comprehensive assistance plans to better promote and protect the rights and support the needs of victims as called for by the United Nations General Assembly. By integrating specific legislative provisions on victims, including in areas such as recognition, access to justice, assistance and support, compensation and remembrance into national comprehensive assistance plans, member states will ensure that efforts to prevent and counter violent extremism conducive to terrorism remain true to victims' needs and rights. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, my office stands ready to provide technical assistance and to work hand in hand with national authorities to address the needs and uphold the rights of victims. We will do so through the Global Victims of Terrorism Support Program and the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism Program Office on Parliamentary Engagement and Preventing and Countering Terrorism in Doha. I look forward to working together towards the effective implementation of the provisions and to supporting member states' efforts to take practical steps in developing national frameworks that are holistic, victim-centric, and sustainable. In this regard, I also look forward to welcoming you at the first Global Congress for Victims of Terrorism, which will take place in New York later this year. To conclude, I would like to express my gratitude to all donors contributing to the implementation of this global program. First of all, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the State of Qatar. I thank you. And now I would like to give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Ghada Fativali, Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and Director General of the United Nations Office in Vienna. Ghada, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vladimir. Distinguished members of Parliament, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to join IPU Secretary General Martin Shugong and my colleague USG Vladimir Voronkov to launch the model legislative provisions to support the needs and protect the rights of victims of terrorism. Parliaments and parliamentarians are at the heart of our democracies. They have the power to act as the conscience of our countries and to give voice to the hopes and needs of the people. UNODC is proud to support parliamentarians in their essential work, including through our cooperation with IPU and regional parliamentary assemblies. And we are especially proud to have contributed to the development of these model provisions, which will guide parliamentarians in elaborating and adopting policies and legislation based on international norms to better assist victims of terrorism. Most victims of terrorism are randomly targeted, people who are innocently going about their lives when the terror struck. Survivors may take years to recover from their injuries or to come to terms with their losses. Women and girls are often targeted by terrorist groups and subjected to horrific acts of gender-based violence. The trauma and devastation caused by terrorism are deep, affecting families, communities, and countries, and potentially spanning generations. Supporting victims of terrorism and their loved ones by recognizing their rights and addressing their needs must therefore be understood as a vital step towards achieving justice and preventing further harm. If they are properly supported, survivors can choose to play a key role in ensuring accountability for terrorist acts and in countering the appeal for terrorism. The model provisions, by acknowledging the difficulties victims face and by listening to and incorporating their perspectives, represent a key component of the integrated comprehensive responses our societies need to prevent terrorist threats and to protect people. The provisions are intended to be a technical assistance tool for strengthening national responses and can be tailored to national needs in line with the constitutional principles and legal tradition of each member state, taking into account the existing legal frameworks. They are the result of more than 1 year of consultations and collaboration between our offices, bringing together victims of terrorism with parliamentarians and other stakeholders to define and elaborate dedicated mechanisms that put the needs and rights of victims at the heart of counter-terrorism responses. The victim-centered approach actively engages victims of terrorism without fear of stigma, reprisal, or secondary victimization. It further enables their contribution and participation also in determining the support they need. The model provisions offer concrete proposals for putting such an approach into action, including through the establishment of a coordination body for victims to manage the delivery of accurate information and services, and through appropriate training for all those in contact with victims of terrorism. Furthermore, the provisions emphasize the importance of individualized and gender-sensitive assistance, which responds to the specific needs and vulnerabilities of victims, including victims of sexual and gender-based violence by terrorist groups and children who are victims of terrorists. The model provisions answer the call of the UN Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy, which encourages member states to create national systems of assistance to promote the needs of victims of terrorism and their families and facilitate the normalization of their lives. They also draw upon UNODC's long experience in providing victim support as well as legislative technical assistance to parliamentarians to address crime, corruption, and terrorism in all their manifestations. Our work and partnership are more important than ever as we face a resurgence of terrorism in many parts of the world. The terrorist threat is diversifying, ranging from the growth of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliates in Africa to advance of far-right extremism in Europe and North America. It is also becoming more lethal as terrorists employ drones and other unmanned aerial vehicles to carry out their attacks. Terrorist groups are engaging in and profiting from trafficking and other forms of organized crime, while corruption and money laundering are helping to funnel illegal proceeds to finance their operations. Tackling interlinked terrorism, crime, and corruption challenges requires comprehensive action, and in response, UNODC is formally exploring a new collaboration framework with IPU to provide integrated normative assistance across a broad range of rule of law challenges. Together, we will work with parliamentarians to further raise awareness and help to identify gaps, develop legislation, and promote international and regional cooperation in line with UN resolutions and mechanisms. We will continue to put a special focus on prevention, promoting human rights, and empowering women and youth in line with UNODC's corporate strategy to tackle the root causes of terrorism and deny terrorists a breeding ground to spread their hateful ideologies and incite violence. Distinguished members of Parliament, Excellencies, UNODC had the honor of co-organizing the first ever Global Parliamentary Summit on Counter-Terrorism last September in Vienna. The summit provided important insights on advancing the parliamentary response to support victims of terrorism and to prevent radicalization and hate speech. The launch of the model provisions today will help take our joint efforts forward. In closing, allow me to thank our many collaborators in the extensive consultations and drafting process leading to the model provisions, including Professors Ben Saul and John Sulzer. My heartfelt thanks go to our colleagues in the UN family, experts, victims organizations, and victims themselves for their invaluable contributions. UNODC looks forward to working with IPU and OCT to support member states with implementing the model legislative provisions to ensure greater support for victims of terrorism and help us to build sustainable pathways to a more peaceful world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Executive Director, for your inspiring and energetic statement. I appreciate very much very close cooperation between my office and UNODC. So I think it's one of the prerequisites to be successful in our common business. And now I would like to give the floor to the Secretary General of the Parliamentary Union, His Excellency Mr. Martin Chungong. Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vladimir. Very good to see you again. And distinguished colleagues, Gada from Vienna. I see also that we have Honorable Reno Lopatka representing not only the OAC Parliamentary Assembly, but also the IPU. And of course, Genaro Migliori, the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. And all protocol observed, it gives me great pleasure to be here today with you for the launch of what I consider to be a very important tool for parliamentarians. We have been saying a lot about the role of parliamentarians, and we do think that parliamentarians need to be tuned to the issues facing the global community. We do know, in fact, today that our world faces numerous complex global challenges, including terrorism and violent extremism, among others. These complex global challenges require global solutions and coordination. Parliaments and parliamentarians, by effectively employing the constitutional mechanisms entrusted to them, the powers to legislate, hold governments accountable, allocate budgets, and ultimately represent the people, must play a pivotal role in translating international commitments into action at the national level and ensuring that they are implemented effectively. Indeed, parliaments and parliamentarians are essential in combating every condition conducive to violent extremism and protecting and defending the rights of the victims of terrorism. Parliaments and parliamentarians play a significant role in shaping prevention and response efforts to conflict-related sexual violence through legislation, oversight, budget allocation, and advocacy. Indeed, parliamentarians can intervene at every stage of radicalization, marginalization, and discrimination of any given group and support the victims of terrorism. They are at the strategic forefront of prevention. Parliamentarians can work with citizens to build various alternative pathways away from hate and violence, and to understand the processes of extremism. These capacities are important prerequisites to design any de-extremization program. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, there you have seen what parliaments can do and should be doing to stem the tide of terrorism globally. And today, I am pleased that we are launching a tool that is designed to help parliaments play that role more effectively. And that is why I am grateful to our colleagues of UNOCT, Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov, Director General Gada, for your very strong leadership in helping develop this particular tool for parliamentarians. In so doing, we are walking the talk. We are advocating for a strong role for parliaments and parliamentarians, and we are actually working towards giving them the capacity to deliver on that role that is expected of them. I think that we are all aware of the fact that parliamentarians represent the people of all shapes and sizes, of all persuasions, and victims of terrorism require specific attention from parliamentarians. And that is why I am pleased today that our cooperation with UNOCT and UNODC in this particular area has come to fruition. We hope that we can now take this tool and popularize it among parliaments to make sure that parliaments draw inspiration from the tool in their efforts to contribute to global endeavors to fight terrorism. It is important that parliaments continue to hold the feet of government to fire to make sure that the fate of victims of terrorism is not forgotten and is on our radar screen. And as Gada was saying a moment ago, the IPU is also committed to pursuing its fruitful cooperation with UNODC and UNOCT so that we can take this very noble task forward. And I look forward to the outcome of the deliberations, and you can be sure that you have my support when it comes to popularizing these model legislative provisions that we have jointly developed in a very consultative process. And I wish on IPU's behalf to thank all those who have been involved, the technical experts, the resource persons, the colleagues in UNOCT and UNODC who have been hard at work to put this together. Let's do them the honor of making sure that these tools are not shelved, but are used by parliamentarians across the world to make a difference when it comes to fighting terrorism. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Dear Secretary General, dear Martin, thank you very much for this very thoughtful ideas, present your statement. First of all, of course, I'm very proud of this very good cooperation with IPU on this very issue and other issues. I think it's very symbolic that we are starting the practice of model legislative provisions from this very important human rights and humanitarian issue of support of victims of terrorism. So I'm looking forward to work very closely with both UNODC and IPU in the next period of time to implement this important document. So thank you again. This concludes the opening session of our meeting. So I would like to invite Ms. Fionnuala Ní Olán, Special Rapporteur on Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while Countering Terrorism, to continue to moderate this event. Fionnuala, the floor is yours, and very glad to see you. Unfortunately, only on the screen, but hopefully we will have an occasion to have an in-person meeting soon.
I thank you, Mr. Voronkov. Vladimir, thank you so much. I'm very, very pleased to be here and to continue the excellent cooperation that my office continues to have with yours. And it's a really important thing, I think, for the Special Rapporteur whose work, as the office's work on human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism, is here to launch this model code, to put these provisions, to learn about them. Because I think one of the things we see more than anything else is that this product has been the result of this extraordinarily robust process of engagement with victims and survivors of terrorism and their organizations. And if I can be a little bold, I think it's a good moment to pause, because since the very inception of this project, what I've witnessed in the creation of the project has been this deep commitment by the Office of Counter-Terrorism and its staff, and most particularly by the Undersecretary General Voronkov, whose deep personal commitment to these issues has been so critical. What we've seen is a collaboration with the expert drafters to carry out a depth and a range of consultation and engagements that, in my view, have been unparalleled in the system. To me, it speaks to the depth of commitment to the promotion and protection of the rights of victims of terrorism here. And it also demonstrates the enormous possibilities of the system, of what's possible when we do robust engagement with civil society, here with victims and their organizations, and put them at the center of the work that we do. I want to also really laud the human rights-based approach that's been evident throughout this process and now really encapsulated in this excellent product. And we know, and I think this is what gives me enormous courage and hope, that we can see how this can be replicated across the entire counterterrorism technical assistance space, and to show us how and lead the way for how we can do this in capacity building wherever the UN is working. So we're all privileged to have these tools available, and we have to, I think, as other speakers before me have done, laud the experts who've dedicated so much of their time and effort to the production of these materials. My colleagues, Professor Ben Saul and Jean Sulzer. The goal of providing support to legislators around the world is really about ensuring that their legal systems can serve victims. And this, if nothing else, is, I think, in a way, it's a noble and just cause, one that's been needed for very long. So as we launch these provisions, many developments for the rights of victims are taking place around the world. And we have this powerful work to ensure that the redress for victims of terrorism is done. We also see other work, for example, the work that's being done in Paris to address the deep, profound harms of the 2015 attacks, which we're going to talk about today. And what we see are these opportunities to concretely pursue justice and accountability for international and national crimes, and doing that in a way that's consistent with international human rights law. So my mandate will continue, and today is another way for us to do this, to engage directly with the victims of terrorism, women and girls, men and boys across the world, calling for their overall protection. So with that to mind, and I'm very pleased to introduce my esteemed colleagues, Professor Jean Sulzer and Professor Ben Saul, who are going to present for us the model provisions, tell us what's in them and how we're going to use them. Ben and Jean, over to you.
Thanks so much, Fionnuala, and Your Excellencies, Mr. Voronkov, Ms. Wiley, and Mr. Chungong, distinguished members of Parliament, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really delighted to join you here from the future in the early hours of Saturday morning here in the Sydney summer. We're so pleased to present a short overview of the model legislative provisions which provide comprehensive guidance to states, particularly lawmakers, on how to protect the rights of victims of terrorism under national law, but also through international cooperation. They're based on existing international law on both victims of crime and human rights violations, as applied to the special needs of victims of terrorism, plus extensive research into good national practices and wide consultations with hundreds of experts from states, international organisations, and civil society. The provisions apply to all victims of terrorism in a state's territory, regardless of their nationality, and also enable states to assist their nationals when they're victims of terrorism abroad, such as through consular assistance and other recognised forms of international cooperation. As Fionnuala mentioned, they take a strong human rights-based approach, and in broad terms, the provisions address 5 basic rights of victims. Rights concerning assistance, reparation, protection, access to justice, and access to information about all of those rights. They also emphasise the pivotal role of victims and victims' associations in the protection of these rights. Firstly, then, on the right to assistance, the provisions address the rights of victims to receive all of the forms of assistance that are necessary to meet their needs as victims, including material, medical, psychological, and social support. They allow flexibility in how assistance is provided in a particular country, whether through governmental, voluntary, community-based, or private means. But they always ensure that assistance is adequate, coordinated, and respects the rights of victims. In particular, they ensure that assistance is accessible on a non-discriminatory basis, including to victims with special needs or vulnerabilities. The provisions acknowledge the resource implications of providing assistance by invoking the well-accepted duty of states to progressively realise socioeconomic rights like healthcare or social support in accordance with their maximum available resources, while ensuring that minimum essential levels of rights are always provided and remedies are available where necessary. Secondly, on the right to reparation, we ensure that the provisions guarantee reparation for all harms suffered from terrorism. Reparation, in accordance with international law, has to be full, adequate, effective, and prompt. As is well known, it includes restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition. Reparation can be provided individually, but also on a collective basis, as where whole communities are affected by terrorism in some contexts. The provisions procedurally allow reparation to be provided either by a terrorist perpetrator in a criminal or civil court proceeding, but they also provide for the state to establish accessible administrative procedures and a no-fault compensation fund for victims, which is particularly important where remedies are not available from perpetrators. Measures of satisfaction are especially significant for victims of terrorism, and so the provisions address the right to know the truth about terrorist crimes, to publicly acknowledge the harm done, to restore victims' dignity, and to preserve historical memory. Thirdly, on protective measures, the model provisions guide states in identifying and mitigating risks to the safety, security, psychological integrity, and privacy of victims and their families. Those risks could arise from violence or intimidation by terrorist groups, but also concern the psychological risks from things like adverse media exposure or inadequate responses by public authorities or assistance providers. The provisions ensure that victims' protection needs are properly and individually assessed, and that effective measures are taken to protect victims inside or outside the courtroom. These could include measures to protect against physical attacks or to prevent unjustified intrusion by the media or unlawful disclosures of private information. Fourthly, access to justice, of course, a vital step in realising all victims' rights is to ensure that victims have access to their rights. This includes providing information about administrative or legal proceedings to access justice, and assistance in navigating the complexities of these processes. And we provide concrete suggestions to facilitate, for example, victim participation in legal proceedings. Where terrorism has a transnational dimension, international cooperation in accessing justice is essential. And the provisions facilitate this by incorporating existing legal frameworks on consular assistance and mutual legal assistance, as well as by identifying other voluntary means of interstate coordination. Finally, fifthly, providing victims with information relevant to them as victims is critical to enable them to obtain effective remedies. The provisions ensure that victims receive timely, accessible, and accurate information about their rights and how, where, and when they can access those rights. I'll now hand over to my colleague to conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. So I will continue to present the model provisions. So in addition to these 5 fundamental human rights that were just addressed and that are covered by specific chapters in the model provisions, the document addresses a range of cross-cutting and operational matters that are considered as key to the implementation and protection of the rights covered in the model provisions. Firstly, a coordination body. The provisions encourage states to establish a permanent, inclusive, and centralized coordination body or contact point to facilitate and coordinate the information and support services for the benefit of victims of terrorism. Such coordination mechanism aims at helping to reduce the risk of receiving contradictory information and as well as to strengthen the cooperation between the relevant authorities and other actors, including civil society organizations. The coordination body would also administer a central referral mechanism in order to identify victims' needs and refer them to the relevant service providers. It would finally include the creation of a voluntary-based registry of victims to enable them to better access their rights. Such a registry is considered as good practice. Secondly, the provisions require a very strong victim-sensitive training. The sensitive training should be organized for all actors in contact with victims of terrorism in order to promote victim-sensitive, impartial, respectful, and professional treatment, including by addressing stereotypes, misconceptions, and stigmas. Trainings should be gender mainstreamed and address risks of secondary victimization. There should also be specialized training appropriate to the specific roles of different actors in relation to victims. Thirdly, the model provisions recognize that there is an important role of civil society organizations. Like other persons, victims of terrorism or have the right to create victims association, as well as the important role of these organizations in the identification of the needs, as well as in the protection, implementation, and awareness raising of the rights of victims themselves. The provision recognizes the need also to protect victims' associations from threats, intimidation, or retaliation, and recognize that many of the protective measures that Ben Sol just talked about for individual victims are also relevant for victims' associations and civil society organizations. In addition to these 3 operational measures, the provisions contain chapters that address the needs of special groups with special vulnerabilities and contain special legal frameworks that would apply to them. These include child victims who must be treated in accordance with international standards and norms regarding child rights and child victims of crime. These also include a chapter specific to victims of sexual and gender-based violence committed by terrorist groups, as well as victims of trafficking, who should first and foremost be recognized as victims, irrespective of their perceived status and affiliation with such groups. They must be protected in a victim-centered and gender-sensitive manner, given tailored, comprehensive, multidisciplinary assistance, and special evidentiary standards and procedures should apply in legal proceedings to prevent secondary victimization of these victims with special needs. The provisions also recognize that assistance, protection, and justice for victims of terrorist acts face additional challenges in situations involving armed conflict or displacement, migration. They are entitled to protection in accordance with applicable international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law, including humanitarian assistance, unimpeded by excessive counterterrorism measures. And finally, there are a number of cross-cutting general principles that are relevant and applicable throughout the provisions, the model provisions. First, a human rights-based approach. All measures must respect human rights and the principle of non-discrimination, whether in relation to victims, in relation to fair trial rights of alleged perpetrators, media freedoms, or the public's right to information. Secondly, a victim-centered approach. All measures must be victim-centered, including through individual assessments of their needs, doing no harm to victims, being sensitive to personal circumstances and vulnerabilities, including gender, age, disability, special needs, and social, economic, and cultural circumstances. Finally, assistance providers should be accountable for the treatment of victims, including via independent review of decisions and possibility of remedies and access to remedies for breaches of victims' rights. And lastly, the principle of non-hierarchy between victims. It is crucial that the model provisions to protect victims of terrorism should not result in discrimination against or unequal treatment of victims of other crimes, human rights violations, or conflict-related violence or affected communities. So to conclude, we hope that the model provisions will aid states in their efforts to assist and protect victims of terrorism in a manner adapted to each national legal system and consistent with international law. Again, these provisions are the result of fruitful cooperation and discussion between the UNOCT, the IPU, and the UNODC, but they also reflect the discussion of over 220 experts involved in many consultations in 2020 and 2021, including representatives of states, parliaments, of the judiciary, law enforcement authorities, international and regional organizations, non-governmental and civil society organizations, victims associations, as well as individual victims. There was a multiplenary input which was received from lawyers, psychologists, women's advocates, witness protection experts, and human rights professionals. I'm concluding here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you to both Jean and Ben. I just want to again acknowledge the robustness and extraordinary depth of this work. And also just to underscore how imbued this process has been with listening to and learning from victims. I think it's one of the things that stands as unique in these kinds of model provisions, methodologies of really placing victims, not just rhetorically at the center, but actually in the center of the process of producing the outcome, which is so important. I also, before we move on, want to acknowledge that Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov. Vladimir, I know you're leaving us to go to another meeting. I want to thank you for your leadership and again, the diligent work of your office and your own personal commitment to this work on victims of terrorism. So as you leave us, I'm also now going to invite the Honourable Geronimo Migliori, who's the President of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean, who's going to join us to visit us with his keynote statement. Over to you. Just making sure that we have Mr. Migliori. Yes. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And first of all, thanks for this kind invitation. I'm really appreciated the very high-standing intervention and it's a pleasure to speak to you today in my capacity as President of Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean. I wish to thank the Interparliamentary Union, the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime for convening this meeting to launch the model legislative provision to which PAM has considerably contributed during the consultation phase that took place last year. PAM has always enjoyed a privileged relation with the United Nations on counter-terrorism issues. In 2021, PAM signed two historical memoranda of understanding with the UNOCT Under-Secretary General, His Excellency Vladimir Voronkov, and the UNODC Executive Director, His Excellency Ghadafati Wali, to consolidate the long-standing cooperation among our organization to achieve the common objective of combating terrorism in all its form and manifestation. I am delighted as well to share this session with my good friend Reinhold Lopakta, that is, among all, Vice President of the Assembly of the OSCE EPA, another key partner of PAM regarding counterterrorism. The multidimensional nature of terrorism poses constantly evolving challenges for the international community. Among them, providing support to the victims of terrorism is one of the top priorities of the agenda of PAM. In this regard, our Assembly has adopted several resolutions with the legislative and policy recommendation to PAM, national parliaments, to harmonize legislation and effectively synchronize parliamentary efforts with the global counter-terrorism strategy and the international instruments to support the victims of terrorism. Excellencies, for that, dear colleagues, over the past years, PAM has been duly working on the issue of ISIL foreign terrorist fighters, with a specific focus on the implementation of United Nations Security Council Resolution 2178, 2396, 2427, international law to repatriate, prosecute, reintegrate, and rehabilitate foreign terrorist fighters and guarantee protection for women and children affected by armed conflicts, including those linked with armed groups and those who have committed crimes, to be treated primarily as victims. Around 30,000 adults and 40,000 children from 60 countries are being detained in Syrian camps. Indefinite detention in often inhuman conditions and unfair trials to ISIL foreign terrorist fighters and their family members cannot be our response to achieve justice for victims of terrorism. Furthermore, detention camps are a breeding ground for ISIL recruitment and represent a major concern for the threat of terrorist attacks worldwide and need to be urgently addressed. Excellencies, for that, states have a primary human responsibility towards the victims of terrorism. Impunity is not acceptable, and in the case of foreign terrorist fighters' repatriation to countries of origin and respect of fundamental human rights and the rule of law are imperative conditions to prosecution. Parliamentarians play a critical role in ensuring that the criminal justice system can address terrorism through human rights compliant prosecution, tailored rehabilitation, and reintegration approaches by placing victims of terrorism at the center of counter-terrorism policies and legislation. Among PAM member states, let me say something about my country, Italy, which presents an advanced system of adapted measures in favor of victims of terrorism due to our experience of both far left and far right accident and killing of political terrorism during the years of left. These measures, as an act of solidarity, provide for economic advantages to compensate the victims of terrorism and their families for their suffering. There is no difference in the treatment of Italians and non-Italians for terrorist attacks that occurred in the country. And the socio-economic assistance is coordinated with the local communities and provided to victims and their family members. This system set an admirable example of how political and social responsibility is taken by the Italian state. In addition to recognize and remember of the victims of terrorism, Italy has established the Memory Day for the victims of the national and international terrorism on the 9th of May, when was killed Aldo Moro. To conclude, the launch of the model legislative provision for victims of terrorism is more than ever necessary and timely. PAN will call on its national parliaments to utilize it as an essential tool to strengthen the national response to this issue, tailored to national needs in line with the constitutional principles and legal tradition. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks to the Honourable Mr. Migliori, and in particular for raising the very challenging issues of repatriation and reintegration in the context of addressing the victims of terrorism, as well as the robust affirmation of the need for accountability, something I think we are all on this call very committed to. I now turn to invite Mr. Reinhold Lupacta, the Vice President of the Assembly of the OSCE, the Parliamentary Assembly, to visit us and to bring his keynote address to this meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Chair, distinguished speakers, and 160 participants, which shows how important this event is. After a comprehensive planning and working process, model legislative provisions for victims of terrorism can finally be launched. And at first, I want to say thank you to all victims of terrorism, victim associations and organizations, also to politicians and experts who were involved in this ambitious, important process. And I have to say thank you to Professor Salzer and Professor Soul for their really impressive presentation. For me, this is a role model how we should work together. Dear colleagues, it is really important and, for me, necessary to start such international initiatives. I'm truly looking forward to see the concrete impact of the model legislative provisions. It is important to coherently address the complex needs of victims of terrorism, integrate such provisions into comprehensive counter-terrorism policies and practices at the national level. In this regard, I cannot stress enough the importance of the useful parliamentary tools which are at our disposal. Let me mention 5. Firstly, through continuous discussions and debates, we can promote constructive exchanges of civil society and interparliamentary cooperation. All our interparliamentary forums. Today, IPU with Secretary General Martin Chung-Gong, and also with Gennaro Migliore, and after me, Professor Jacqueline O'Toole will take the floor. We have all the chance in different interparliamentary forums to support this work. Secondly, we strive to contribute the timely implementation of international counter-terrorism framework. Advocate for including victims association in relevant consultative processes. This is important for new legislative frameworks, but also amending existing ones. Thirdly, we urge states to develop forward-looking policy guidance. Fourthly, we should use the platforms such as the OECD to keep this topic high on the agenda of all our states, especially now. We have to be frank, when the world's attention has been shifted towards fighting the pandemic. And fifthly, through our oversight tools, we can urge our national parliaments to monitor thoroughly the implementation of national legal frameworks, as that is a vital step in making sure that the laws are not a mere letter on the paper and that they fulfill their purpose. So, dear colleagues, counterterrorism efforts cannot be successful until victims of terrorism are included in a truly meaningful way. This is one of the lessons I have. The OSCE PA and our counterterrorism committee stands ready to continue the contribution to strengthen the parliamentary effort, ensuring the protection of rights and needs of victims of terrorism. In particular, and after CCP has conducted several important field visits, conferences, discussions on this topic, we will further these efforts by attending the PAN UN-OCD Joint Conference on Victims of Terrorism, which should take place later this year in Rome. Of course, parliaments, and I want to conclude with this, certainly play an important role in this process, but it is crucial to ensure strong and timely cooperation with our governments, international organizations like today, civil society, experts in the field, academia, of course, and especially, as I mentioned it very often, victims of terrorism. Only in this way we can continue to learn the diverse needs of victims of terrorism and provide them adequate support. So thank you for your attention, and also thank you for this event.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reinhold Lupakta. I do want to underscore the importance of it seems so obvious to say that parliaments are central to this conversation. But as we've seen through the pandemic in particular, the ways in which parliamentary processes can be excluded, I think, reminds us of the importance and the central role that the parliaments in any country must play to ensuring and engaging with these issues in a sustained way. So it's now the time where we turn to the third part of this dialogue today, where we turn to the interactive dialogue. And we have a remarkable set of speakers for this dialogue. And I think it's going to speak to the richness of those who've informed these model provisions and really deepen our understanding of what's in them. Before we get started, I'll make one or two remarks in my role as Special Rapporteur. As many here are aware, many of you that we work with so closely, the mandate I hold has a particular responsibility for addressing the needs of victims in the context of terrorism and counterterrorism. And in that context, accountability, transparency, and reparation are the key focuses of the mandate's work. And so in reflecting on the field of counterterrorism and where it's been and where it's going, it's in this context that we have to centralize victims' rights and accountability for victims. I was reminded at an event my mandate co-sponsored on the margins of the Human Rights Council session last July, prior to the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, of the importance of victims' rights. This event, which was co-sponsored with the permanent missions of Norway and Afghanistan, and with Afghanistan's Independent Human Rights Commission, was really part of an early effort to identify a path towards accountability for the gross violations of human rights carried out by terrorist groups that had resulted in the deadliest year on record, targeting women and girls in particular, those women and girls exercising what many of us would consider to be the most basic of rights, the right to education, targets on civil society, on academics, on health workers, on human rights defenders, on media workers and civil servants. And my reflections then, I think, are as relevant as they are now. And the joint statement that I and 18 other special rapporteurs issued followed the event. And they were to speak to the victims of terrorism around the world. And I said then, and I say now again, all survivors of human rights violations and terrorism must be respected and protected. They're entitled to recognition, to be treated with compassion and respect for their dignity, to be informed of their rights to redress and more. And so I would challenge us all as we go forth from today with the insights that we're going to gain, both from the model provisions, but from the voices we're going to hear from today, to understand that the rights of victims of terrorism do not have an expiry date. We live in a world where political realities and the passing of time often cast a shadow over the path towards justice and path towards accountability for victims. And it's often the victims, the survivors, and civil society who are the ones carrying the weight of lifting this enormous shadow so we can see and hear what they say. And so I challenge us all to remain vigilant, to remain attuned, to be unwavering in our commitment to support states in advancing the rights of victims, and to do that without discrimination, to advocate for those who need these rights to be realized, even in the most challenging of contexts. So with that in mind, we're going to turn and listen to a number of our speakers who are really on the front lines of many of these issues to advance the rights of victims. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Mr. Arthur Deneveux, the president of Life for Paris, an extraordinary organization, an association that has welcomed victims, survivors, families of victims, first responders, and caregivers, all who were directly affected by the attacks of November 13th, 2015. And those days are really prescient in our memories right now. So I'm going to ask Mr. Deneveux the first question. And as you know, the right to justice is one of the most essential components of the model legislative provisions. And this right to access to justice is intrinsically linked to a number of other rights like truth, protection, privacy, reparation, and assistance. You have been a passionate advocate for victims' access to justice. And this trial of the Paris attacks has just started. It's been going since September last year. And it has quite a ways to go until June, likely next year. So as a direct victim yourself, and as the president of one of the main organization of victims of these November attacks, are there any lessons that you can share with us about the role and the place of victims in a terrorist-related criminal trial? Particularly tell us about how we should be doing the access to justice for victims. Mr. Deneveux.
Thank you very much for this excellent question. I hope my video works because I think it's been deactivated. If I look at it from a distance, I think terrorist-related criminal trials are always very complex affairs. You know, they touch upon national, political, and emotional issues all at the same time and in the same place. It has proven hard for victims to find a place in such trials because, you know, terrorism victims are usually targeted in lieu of the society they belong to rather than for who they really are. And so their legitimacy is constantly questioned. Fortunately, and that's the case in France, this vision is slowly changing and victims of terrorism find the place they deserve at the trials, which is, in my view, double. They are those who suffered directly, and their testimony is key to any form of trial. But they are also the symbols of a resilient population facing their executioners, a symbol of action and not resignation. And I think acknowledging this double role is a safe way to help welcome back victims in the fold of society. And that's what we are currently seeing in France. Victims of the November 13th attacks, including myself, feel that their stories told in the courtroom in Paris have been added to the history of France, and that is a very useful recognition of our suffering. They also feel that the trial benefits from their presence while not relying on it, which relieves us from some weight. In short, trials benefit from the presence of victims, and victims benefit from the organization of trials. So I think it's a clear win-win situation.
I love that imagery of both resistance and burdens being lifted, because I think those are really important images to hold as we think about transforming how we understand the place of victims and survivors. I'm going to turn to ask and introduce the Honourable Professor Jacqueline Odul. She's a member of the National Assembly and member of the Executive Board of the Kenya Women Parliamentary Association. She's also a member of the Secretary General's panel on gender, has been a member of the high-level advisory group on counter-terrorism and violent extremism of the IPU, And Professor O'Doul, I want to ask you, maybe picking up on the threads we've had earlier from our parliamentarians speaking, to ask you to talk to the fact that the role of parliaments is essential in ensuring that these model provisions of terrorism will be used and integrated, that they don't sit on shelves, essentially. It's going to be essential to ensure that we get national comprehensive assistance plans in place, anchored into national legal frameworks. So how do you see, as someone who's doing this work in a daily way, how do you see the model provisions being useful practically for parliamentarians?
Thank you very much. Would want to thank Excellencies, UNOCT, UNODC, and all other experts for this opportunity, and to indicate that the humanitarian challenge that is posed by terrorism to global fraternity cannot be understated. In Kenya, where I am a member of parliament, just this week, the barbaric acts of terrorism occurred on Monday, 31st January, when a minibus ran over an improvised explosive device set up by the Al-Shabaab terrorist group, killing 6 passengers and injuring several others. As we tackle this matter, we are aware that globally, we have passed legislation on anti-terrorism, aiming specifically at controlling transnational organized crime. However, we can also see that few have adopted policies and legislations on the rights of victims of terrorism. So as we reflect today, I'd like to draw attention to 2 categories, as has been indicated by my colleague: those who are affected directly, and this is in different ways, individually or collectively, suffering harm, physical or mental injury, emotional suffering, and economic loss, or just substantial impairment of their fundamental rights. And the second category, the immediate family of dependents or the direct victims or persons who have suffered. The parliamentarians, who are representatives of the people and really the mediators between the people, the citizenry and government, really have a major role to ensure that the civilian population that usually is the one that is affected and who have to grapple with issues such as medical care, counseling, assistive products, and financial compensation, they do this in very unclear terms, in the absence of proper legislation, proper framework, and proper collective way of dealing with issues. And so as we look today at this model, we find a timely guidance to Parliament, because parliaments allocate resources, and when appropriate, they come up with legislations, and indeed, they also are the ones that can enhance not just the utilization, but also the allocation of these funds. For example, in Kenya, due to activism on cases of human-wildlife conflict, there exist policies for compensation of personal injuries, deaths, damage to property, and crops. However, similar comprehensive measures in relation to terrorism, whose scope and magnitude has potential of causing large-scale damage to humanity, have not been designed. And so, as we look at this, we want to see that this model creates the agency within which Parliament, by calling for action on the rights of victims of terrorism, can alleviate the suffering of victims and their families. There's a second question. I don't know if you want me to quickly just
we'll come back if that's okay. I'm going to encourage those joining us to make sure that their microphones are switched off. Thank you. And Professor O'Doul, I'm going to return to you in a minute. We'll do one more round with our initial speakers and come back. And I thank you in particular for flagging for us just this sort of practicalities of Parliament seizing the moment. not letting the moment pass and transferring the goodwill that we see evidenced in the production of these model provisions into action, which is legislative action. I'm going to turn now and introduce Dr. Fatima Ali Hadar, who's the co-founder of the Grief Directory, victims and a member of the core group of experts on the model legislative provisions. The Grief Directory is an organization created in January 2015, but it works really in a very unique way to counter extremist narratives and offer support to sufferers of violent extremism. And so let me ask you, Dr. Hadar, the role of civil society, of which your organization is a part, the role of victims associations and victims themselves is really critical in promoting the rights and needs of victims, especially at national and regional levels, because actually it's often very difficult to get the kind of outreach that's needed to affected communities. So how can these model legislative provisions ensure that states really support civil society actors? And why do we need states to do that work with civil society actors, walking hand in hand with those who are working for and representative of victims of terrorism? Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Finola, and honored to be here today at this distinguished platform. Please allow me to address the second part of the question first regarding the importance of civil society and state collaborations. Firstly, state civil society organization collaborations allow pooling of valuable resources important for countries affected by decades of terrorism. While state resources are often focused on hardcore measures for countering terrorism, civil society organizations hold knowledge of the ground reality of the victims, especially civilians, which can provide a valuable assistance not only to the state, but also international organizations in establishing context-specific and culturally sensitive support systems for the victims. In turn, the civil society organizations can then rely on the state to provide safe access to the conflict-affected areas. Secondly, due to the limited funds and lack of access to relevant databases, CSOs are often unable to carry out research-based activities. Here, the state operators can assist CSOs in terms of physical spaces, human resources, and access to proprietary or sensitive information regarding victims. Therefore, collaborations can help address the disconnect which often exists between the state and the civil society, and it can also act as a conduit to renew trust among all stakeholders. Now, coming to the second part of the question, the very important fact why we are gathered here today on this historic moment. Taking a victim-centric and victim-inclusive approach, model legislative provisions provide a comprehensive framework for state civil society collaborations in various domains of victim support, including direct victim assistance, rights to compensation, access to justice, rehabilitation, special needs assistance, and measures for countering violent extremism. Firstly, model provisions encourage states to set up a permanent coordination body, which can serve as the main point of contact for state civil society collaborations. Projects can use the respective domain of expertise of both the states and the civil society organizations, taking a synergistic approach, including engagement with and of victims, of which victim sensitivity training for all stakeholders is essential. Secondly, lack of national legislative frameworks for victim support often impede effective service provision, resulting in CSOs spending valuable resources and advocating for the drafting and implementation of the necessary laws to close the gaps. The model legislative provisions encourage member states to draft national laws and to review and update their existing legislative frameworks for providing support to the victims. Further, CSOs require access to victim information for victim assistance. Model provisions encourage member states to gather multimodal intersectional data, which is extremely important and valuable for CSOs in setting up institutionalized support systems, especially women and children. Additionally, CSOs report that immediate relief is often provided to the victims, but they are subsequently forgotten by both the state and the society. Model provisions therefore address the multimodal and evolving immediate to long-term needs of victims, including material, medical, and psychological support, and protection of family and child rights. Together, these provisions can assist in setting up a one-stop shop for victims, something we've been advocating for since 2016, since the setup of the Brief Directory, focusing on the multifactorial nature of the needs of the victims of terrorism. Model provisions also encourage the state to set up a victim fund in consultation with the CSOs, victims, and victim organizations. Lastly, CSOs working with victims often focus on women as key to the stability of victim families, as they are the worst affected in certain conditions where breadwinners have lost their lives. The model legislative provisions encourage states to apply a gender-sensitive lens while designing and implementing laws, gathering data, and developing security systems. Taken together, therefore, projects which include both the state and the civil society can, in my opinion, set a precedence of collaboration and synergy for the mutual benefit of all.
Thank you. Really comprehensive, I think, and I just want to underscore the importance of the message about promoting civil society, because one of the really unfortunate collisions we find often is that in places where victims of terrorism need the most support are often the places where civil society is under most stress. And so ensuring that we have a strong, healthy, supported civil society is actually a means to ensure that victims of terrorism will get the kinds of space and access that they need to do the work that they do, and the associations that support them are protected. So with that in mind, I'm now, and with your really very neat line to bring us to talk about gender issues in the context of the model provisions, it's my great pleasure to introduce Ms. Aman Saeed Tahia. Aman is someone my mandate works very closely with in UN Women, so I'm particularly delighted to have her with us as she joins us from the Peace and Security section of UN Women, where she's a policy specialist and was a member of the core group of experts. Aman, I want to flag for you, as you already know, that the model provisions have been drafted with a strong gender component. And this is really to ensure, as speakers have already identified, that we have a specific attention to the rights and needs of women, girls, boys, and men, and that those are really the focus of legislative attention. And there are several chapters in these model provisions that focus on gender-based violence committed by terrorist groups. And they show in specific ways the impact of armed conflicts on victims of terrorism. So I guess what I really want you to tease out for us is what features should assistance and support mechanisms have in order that they can take into account and cater for the needs of victims who have these specific vulnerabilities. Child victims, particularly girls and boys, and women who may have been victims of sexual and gender-based violence. Iman, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fionnuala, and thank you so much for the organizers and also the professors who put and developed this instrument. I think from UN Women's side, we're very happy to see gender taken seriously and mainstreamed in the process, but also within the substance of the document. And it's our hope that the work continue in different aspects of the work of the UN and counterterrorism, following this very excellent example. Fionnuala, I think some of the critical features of assistance in general is that the mechanism must be gender sensitive and gender responsive. And it must also seek to be providing a comprehensive kind of support to victims of terrorism for several reasons. But I would like to underscore that unfortunately many times we see the error of equating gender with women only, while gender sensitive and responsive approach is essentially about identifying the particular needs of women, men, and other minority groups, and then proactively placing appropriate measures to address these needs. And I think the model provides a very good guidance and model provisions to that end that can come in very handy. Acts of terrorism inflict serious human rights violations. It harms the social fabric of a given community, and hence there are many layers and different aspects to these needs. And that's why there needs to be an extra effort looking at systemic barriers within the institution, within the laws, within issues of stigma within the society, and they impact these individuals differently. And that's essentially when we meet by gender mainstreaming and gender responsive approaches. I think it's also critical that multifaceted challenges surrounding the context of victims of terrorism is very important to be taken into account. In one study commissioned by UN Women among victims of terrorism, women complained bitterly of the lack of support within the existing restitution mechanism to their family members. As the distinguished panelist from Kenya mentioned, this is a very important aspect. They complained of mental health issues that were rampant, the lack of education opportunities for children, access to livelihoods, and basically there was a state of, they were paralyzed and weren't able to move forward with their life, given that there is a compensation restitution mechanism in place. And that is one example of how taking out gender mainstreaming out of and gender responsive aspects out of the planning, this is one adverse impact. These challenges and vulnerabilities must be acknowledged as a right, but also as a measure of non-repetition by addressing root causes of violence and ensuring there are actually protection actions. I would also like to highlight the principle of non-discrimination when developing compensation schemes and actions. Women in affected communities stress discriminatory practices that are reaffirmed by certain practices and some compensation schemes, with women receiving half or lesser amounts assigned to men when the majority of households are left headed by single women. Same apply to issues related to land and property. In one example, women were given land and property jointly with distant relative males within the family, a situation that rendered them very vulnerable and ended in endless disputes and harassment of women. And I think that also goes against the principle of do no harm when developing these action plans. It was also reported that in some instances, some schemes affirm discriminatory practices within communities, putting women at a disadvantage in the first place. And that is why the principle of non-discrimination is really key. It's also linked to the issue of fairness and linked to access to justice, as the speakers before me mentioned. In contexts where there are challenges to the access to justice, women and vulnerable groups are usually impacted disproportionately. It's also That's why it's very critical to assess the challenges related to the status quo when it comes to access the justice system and other measures to ensure fairness. Finally, I would like to add that accessibility to support these mechanisms is, of course, linked to information sharing and addressing lack of awareness, especially in some instances where communities live in peripheral areas and borderland areas. Women and sectarian minorities were exploited by middlemen who posed as people who can broker that kind of assistance to reach them. So accessibility, moving more broadly from awareness raising and outreach, it also needs to come closer to the communities in their language, and it should be accessible to all. Hence, extra efforts are needed to ensure that information and support is accessible, and to look at ways to get information to segments of society that are usually isolated from the public sphere. And of course, the issue that distinguished panelist Ms. Fatima Haidar mentioned is the issue of capacity building to ensure there is gender-sensitive approaches when victims attempt to access these mechanisms is also linked to accessibility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Iman. And thank you also in particular. I really welcome the attention to say when we use the word gender, we tend to elide that with women and understanding and recognizing that men and boys are victims of terrorism. They experience vulnerability and burdens and harms in ways that are often unseen or unable to be manifested in societies. As well as reminding us of the kind of structural terrorism never lands in a neutral universe. It lands in a universe of pre-existing inequalities that can have profound impacts on women and girls in particular. I'm going to turn back to Arto, who's going to come back to us to talk a little bit about something that I think is very prescient at the moment as we watch the trial in Paris. And Mr. De Nouveau, I wanted to ask you about the positive role of the media, as well as the challenges of victims working with media. And how can we enhance that positive role while maintaining the fundamental right to privacy and intrusion against privacy for victims of terrorism? This is something I know that victims associations in Paris have been thinking profoundly about. Over to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we all see that media have a hunger for the stories of victims of terrorism, for the civilians that faced war on home soil. I'd like to stress that this media attention is not necessarily negative. It even proves necessary to raise awareness on the complex suffering of terrorism victims. And I think our political weight, as an association, as victims, owes much to the media. Still, at the same time, we all understand that being shielded from the public eye is often a key factor of healing. And at the very least, being in control of their image, both during the events and after, is absolutely necessary for victims to gain back, the trust in others that has been shattered by the attack. So there's a delicate balance, and I think this delicate balance can be enhanced by provisions that ensure that media follow a strict code of ethics when it comes to terrorism victims. Everything must be done with the consent of the victims and with a control on the future replays and on the internet referencing in the future. If I had to sum it up, I'd say that the global idea we've come, to like is that victims of terrorism must feel safe enough to speak because it is important, while knowing that in a way they own the content created with their participation and their suffering.
But this is extraordinary, prescient, but so difficult in a universe where so many, the ownership of words, the ownership of images, and the capacity to regulate that has been under-implemented, under-enforced in so many countries with really extraordinary, what we might think of as secondary harm for victims of terrorism, the harm of the attack or the violence, and then the secondary harm of how one is treated in the aftermath. And I think the call to a code of ethics and conduct is a really important one. Jacqueline, I'm going to come back to you and ask you maybe to focus in on us, help us think this through from the practical perspective of a parliament. How can these model provisions, the normative frameworks, actually guarantee in practice support for victims? You've talked a little bit about this already, but maybe you'd pull out one or two specific examples for us to concretize how we move from words to action.
Thank you very much. The model provisions will provide the appropriate framework for guiding members to adequately implement the United Nations Resolution 73305 on the enhancement of international cooperation to assist victims of terrorism. This is because the resolution reaffirms the commitment of member states to take measures aimed at addressing the dehumanization of victims of terrorism in all its forms of manifestations. So specifically, we can see that one, the normative framework would guide member countries to ensure that all victims of terrorism are supported. As we know, the complex nature of the violence perpetrated by terrorists and resulting complexity of how victims of terrorism are identified sometimes results in a case where victims are overlooked in terms of support. The model provisions would also enhance the support given to victims of terrorism in terms of addressing areas where loss of life or death caused by terrorism occurs. We can see the example that in 2017 occurred in the Middle East, and we know in Africa and South Asia, there have been other examples. So it is important that we look and see at the way that this model provision will address what in most countries in these regions face in terms of social, political, and economic challenges that hamper efforts aimed at providing their lives as citizens, and therefore also reflecting on this. I think I would want, by way of conclusion, to indicate that we are also going to find that there will be uniformity in laws on support of victims of terrorism, and that we would find that there is a way where a country such as Kenya, where I am, we are able to not just look at the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which we have from 2012, to provide measures for the detection and prevention of terrorist activities, but we would now go beyond just prohibiting the publishing or broadcasting of photographs. Therefore, domesticating the model provisions would guarantee that member states adequately support victims of terrorism. And this is critical, given, as we have highlighted during this conversation, that we need to get Parliament to then ensure that member states do guarantee and make legislation and then undertake the necessary oversight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that domestication process is going to be the next big step, the launch that we all have to see from these provisions. I want to return to Dr. Ali Haider and ask her really to talk to us about another aspect of this challenge for victims, which is the deep sense of isolation that so many victims feel, that they face their bereavement or their trauma alone, and the great loss that terrorism brings in multiple facets on their own. So how does something like a model legislative provision address these challenges of promoting civil society, but also promoting this practical solidarity that can be brought to victims of terrorism? How do we close the gap of isolation in practical terms for victims of terrorism?
Finola, thank you so much. And I would like to respond to this question, a very important question, both as a victim and as a member of the civil society. And as a victim and as a member of the civil society, we definitely experience how victims of terrorism often feel alienated and isolated from the society. And this especially applies to special groups, women who've been affected, who've been left behind, the children. My colleagues have mentioned other groups who are suffering disability and isolation and lack of recognition. Therefore, a major component of our work as a civil society organization is to engage with victims to somewhat address this alienation and isolation, raising awareness and working for the recognition and acknowledgement of their needs. Model legislative provisions thus take a number of approaches to encourage states to promote solidarity among victims, society, and the state itself. Firstly, model legislative provisions encourage states to create a registry of victims, the first step towards recognition for the victims. What is not counted is easier to ignore, and any meaningful development of institutional support must first have a reckoning of harm done and damages incurred. From there, national institutionalized support systems expressed in the model provisions as national assistance plans are needed to address the basic physical and emotional needs of the victims, a very important factor for the victims that they are recognized by the state, of which provisions for counseling and victim support groups are an essential component to remind the victims that they are not alone. Here, state civil society collaborations through a permanent coordination body, as mentioned in the model provisions, are central to bridging the gaps among different stakeholders. Then model legislative provisions encourage states to institutionalize support systems, which ensures equality of service provision, thereby eliminating the hierarchy of victims, another reason for their feeling of isolation and alienation. The act of the states reaching out to victims to address their basic needs also reduces their sense of isolation and inculcates acknowledgement. Model provisions also encourage states to include victims across all levels of legislation and implementation, which is paramount to restoring victims' faith in the state. A lack of acknowledgement of their loss, especially over time, has in our experience been described by victims as a key issue contributing to their alienation. Thus, memorialization plays a huge role in promoting solidarity. Model provisions encourage states to commemorate victims through ceremonies, memorials, and monuments. We observe International Day of Victims of Terrorism in August every year, an occasion to promote solidarity among victims internationally. Through this platform, I, as a victim, and many of my other colleagues, victims of terrorism from Pakistan, connected with other victims across the world, which has been a great source of healing for us. I hope that through model legislative provisions, states can carry forward this tradition by observing national days of remembrance dedicated to terrorism victims, mirrored by regional governments and state apparatus as a public acknowledgement of responsibility. This can help build broken social bonds in societies affected by terrorism.
Thank you.
We, the terrorism of victims, often struggle to find meaning and purpose amidst our loss and pain. 18th February will mark the 9th anniversary of the terrorism incident in which I lost my husband and my son. This February, however, I feel hopeful that through this commendable effort of model legislative provisions, we are working towards a safer, more inclusive, just and equal world. I congratulate UNOCT, UNODC, and IPU, and a note of gratitude for the professors on launching this historic document, and grateful for the opportunity to be a part of this event here today. Thanks, Finola.
Thank you, Fatima. Really, really extraordinary in terms of telling us very practically and telling those who have the power to make the change by putting in place these provisions how to do it. We're now going to turn to Iman for the last questions. The last 3 minutes of the session belong to UN Women. Iman, as we go, and then we'll go to the floor. I wonder if you can tell us in particular, and picking up on your earlier remarks, how we address the equality and human rights of women as we put in place these action plans that are envisaged by the model legislative provisions to support victims of terrorism. Over to you, Iman.
Thank you so much, Finola. Just building on what my colleagues mentioned, I think Professor Bin Sol mentioned that the model came after the effort of extensive research on best practices, and I think this is really an important added value, as it also incorporates the gaps and the lessons identified in existing support mechanisms. So this is one important aspect to the module. And I think also it's very important that the module be taken and utilized in its entirety when attempting to develop support mechanisms because of the gender mainstreaming aspect and because the alignment to international standards within that. So I think that's also a great added value for member states. But building on my previous intervention, the model is gender responsive and needs of women and men are addressed across different chapters in the document, especially with regard to SGBV, trafficking, access to justice, and then the assistance prescribed. But I would also like to underline the preserving of his historical memory as essential for acknowledgement and as a measure of non-repetition. These provisions, all of them in this model, provide a great guidance on how to follow a gender-sensitive approach. I think it must be noted that in some instances where support mechanisms are operating in contexts where there are inherent gaps and barriers to justice, evidently an excellent action plan will not be able to deliver on its objectives. So, for example, the model includes relevant chapters on evidentiary standards and guiding principles. I think it's very much needed, especially in contexts where these standards put women at a disadvantage. For example, women attempting to access the justice systems, but because of the existing evidentiary status, standards might end up being incriminated under adultery provisions. And these are actual cases. So to conclude, I would really like to reiterate that the model is more effective when taken in its entirety and can guide member states by its spirit and principles when developing mechanisms and action plans, but also in support of, expressing the will and allocating resources and the actual effort to ensure it's operationalized and not remain a dead letter, if you wish. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman. Very practical solutions from UN Women, as always, and thank you. We're now going to go to statements from the floor, and it's my particular pleasure to introduce Ambassador Santos Maravar, who's the ambassador and permanent representative of the mission of Spain to the United Nations, and who's going to deliver a statement on behalf of the group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism. Spain has been at the forefront of nationally addressing the rights of victims of terrorism over many decades, and I think is one of the countries who've put victims of terrorism at the heart of the work that has been done nationally. And I also want to congratulate Ambassador Santos Maravar for his leadership of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy Review process last year, in which yet again victims of terrorism were given central space and voice by the co-chairs, Spain and Oman. Ambassador Agustin, over to you.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala. It's a pleasure being here with you. Thank you for your kind words, and merited, obviously, but thank you so much. My task here is to deliver the statement on behalf of the Group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism, which is a group of nearly 50 member states at this moment. Under Secretary General Vladimir Voronkov, Executive Director Gada Fatiwali, Secretary General Chung Gong, Excellencies, distinguished victims and representatives of victims associations. The group commends the coordinated work of the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the Interparliamentary Union dedicated to support the victims of terrorism and to welcome the launch of the model legislative provisions. We wish to take advantage of this occasion to encourage the efforts that brings together governmental institutions such as parliaments and civil society organizations, including victims associations, in collaboration with the United Nations entities to strengthen support for the rights and needs of the victims. As we witness all the pain and long-standing suffering caused by the terrorist attacks to the victims and their families, we firmly condemn terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, strongly believe that there cannot be any exception or justification for any act of terrorism, regardless of motivations behind such acts, and wherever, whenever, and by whomever committed, and reiterate our commitment to fight terrorism in a collective way. We wish to express our deepest empathy and solidarity to the grieving families, as well as all people who continue to struggle due to their horrific experiences, and urge member states to fulfill their obligations by bringing the perpetrators of those heinous terrorist acts to justice. We reiterate our conviction that the voice of the victims of terrorism must be heard on the international stage. This group of Friends of Victims of Terrorism seeks to promote and protect the human rights of the victims of terrorism and to advocate their diverse needs throughout their lives after their terrible experiences. We recognize in this regard the purpose of developing model legislative provisions as a reference, whether for the review of existing laws related to victims of terrorism or for promoting the exchange of information on existing good practices and lessons learned. Therefore, we take this opportunity to call upon all states to provide the victims of terrorism with proper support, assistance, and rehabilitation to ensure that their needs are met, their human rights are recognized and protected, in particular for women, children, and with special attention to the importance of recognition, acknowledgement, remembrance, dignity, respect, reparation, accountability, justice, and truth. In this regard, we recall the 7th review of the Global Counter-Terrorism Strategy adopted by consensus, which recognizes the role that victims of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations can play, and emphasize the need to promote international solidarity in support of victims of terrorism. The 7th review also asks for ensuring that victims of terrorism are treated with dignity and respect, that their right to access to justice and redress mechanisms is fully respected, and that the establishment, the strengthening and expansion of funds for compensation or reimbursement to victims should be encouraged. We acknowledge the importance of building the resilience of victims of terrorism and their families as an integral part of a counter-terrorism strategy. We encourage member states to develop comprehensive assistance plans for them and to incorporate them in their national counter-terrorist strategies and related legislation, including the provision of legal, medical, psychosocial, or financial support, which should be presented adequately and immediately after an attack and in the long term. We also acknowledge the meaningful role that victims of terrorism must play in all our counter-terrorism efforts. This is why we remain firmly committed to increasing our efforts to raise awareness and solidarity in the need to promote and protect the rights of the victims of terrorism and to empower their messages to counter the destructive narratives and intolerance promoted by heinous terrorist groups. On that account, we must provide them with the appropriate instruments, and as the group of friends of victims of terrorism, together with the United Nations and all the interested entities, we will continue to examine and develop possible initiatives to make it possible. The work that has been presented through these events is a positive example of collaboration between international institutions and a very useful tool for member states to ensure that the assistance plans are anchored in the legal frameworks, therefore upholding the needs and rights of victims of terrorism. And today's event is very timely, being the first event of this year on this important issue and setting the stage for the upcoming celebration of the first Global Congress of Victims of Terrorism. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador. And just to underscore the importance of the work done by the group of friends, not just its symbolic importance, but the value of bringing states together in a coherent and consistent way, as well as just thank you for sharing the language of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review, a statement of the commitment of the will of all states to address the rights of victims of terrorism. So with that, I now turn to Her Excellency, Ms. Carmen Bravo Paredes, the Chief of Cabinet and the Director General for the Support of Victims of Terrorism in Spain, again speaking to the deep work being done by Spain in a practical way every day to promote and protect the rights of victims of terrorism. Over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Carmen. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'm afraid I cannot turn on the web camera because it's not working. But anyway, I just wanted, first of all, to thank you everyone for all your excellent work, all the experts, all the victims that have provided their work for this very important thing to happen. And also, I always wanted to say that Spain has worked really hard on the rights of victims of terrorism. Sadly, we have had experience in this area, and we have been working for almost 40 years now. The role of civil society has been key in all of this. Everything started with the excellent work and excellent labor of the Spanish associations for victims of terrorism, and the society has gained confidence and has gained awareness in what society means in what terrorism means for society. Terrorism is a crime against society. It's a crime against everyone. Of course, there are individual victims, but the targets, it's society, it's democracy, and it's the state. So I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of my country and to all of the experts. And of course, our expertise is at your disposal in anything you may need. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to make a note. We have a long list of speakers today, but we've been running over time. So we will not be able to get everyone whom we had hoped to get on the floor. I'm just going to let you know that I'll go as far as I can in the list, and then we'll ask everyone to submit their statements, which will be uploaded, and we will have them available at the end of the process of today's recording. But let me now, with that, turn to His Excellency, Mr. Abdullah Al Ifan, who is a member of the Arab Parliament, who will deliver his 1-minute statement. Thank you. Mr. Alifan, are you with us? Maybe we seem to be having difficulties. I'm going to proceed to ask His Excellency Mr. Monder Bouden to speak to us, who's a member of the National Assembly of Algeria. Oh, we've got you. Great. Yes, we have you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. شكرا جزيلا على إعطاء الكلمة. بسم الله.
Thank you for giving me the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, may the peace, mercy, and blessing of God be upon you. At the outset, I would like to express my thanks and appreciation to all the organizers of this event, which is the culmination of the considerable efforts undertaken in 6 consecutive meetings to prepare the global model legislative provisions for victims of terrorism. These efforts were a part of the joint cooperation program between the IPU, UNOCT, and UNODC. The Arab Parliament was keen to participate in the 6 previous meetings, proceeding from its belief in the importance of sharing national, regional, and international experiences to achieve the best model legislation on dealing with and compensating victims of terrorism, and to disseminate such legislation to meet the needs of such victims at all levels. In this context, I would like to emphasize that Arab states are among the world's most affected by terrorism, and yet they are among the states that are most eager to support and care for the victims of terrorism, given the high price these countries have paid to sacrifice the blood of their people in fighting this abhorrent phenomenon. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that the model legislative provisions that we are launching today will be an important reference for many states that do not have independent legislation on this vital question, as it will be a reference for updating and improving existing legislation in this area. The Arab Parliament will prepare a draft uniform Arab law to support victims of terrorism, guided by these model legislative provisions, which we call to issue in a consolidated guide and to translate into the different languages of the world to maximize the widest possible use. While recognizing the importance of enacting legislation to ensure the careless support of victims of terrorist operations, nevertheless, this is not sufficient. Such legislation should be an important dimension of an integrated system to provide all forms of care and support to victims of terrorism, including economic, social, health, educational, and psychological care. There is also a critical need to raise global awareness of the importance of this issue, to assist and support the victims of terrorism and their relatives, so that this issue becomes a well-established principle, not just under the norms of international law, but also within national, regional, and international practices. I am confident that the considerable effort that we have made over the past meetings leading up to today's event constitutes a significant step in this path, so that we can find the best possible ways to support this priority group with attention and care. I thank you.
Shukran. Thank you very much for your remarks. I now turn to Mr. Mouder Bouden, member of the National Assembly of Algeria, for a 1-minute intervention. Thank you. Are you with us, Your Excellency? Conscious of the time, I'm going to proceed to invite His Excellency, Mr. Mohan Paris, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of the Mission of Sri Lanka to the United Nations. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Session Chair.
for the floor. You may not see me on the video, but
we hear you well, Excellency. Go ahead.
Loud and clear. Let me thank you for this wonderful.
Colleagues, I'm going to ask the ambassador to proceed, and then we'll come back to Algeria just so that we use the time as effectively as we can. Ambassador, if you don't mind proceeding, and then we'll come back to the colleague from Algeria who will join us thereafter.
Thank you, Session Chair. Thanks a lot. May I thank you for this wonderful discourse that we've had on the model law. I think there's been, since the basic principles of justice for victims and crime, the abuse of power in 1985, the Declaration of Basic Principles of Justice was put in place as far back as that. We now have with us a solid bit of model law that we can have as a threshold to work on. And I think that's commendable. That's really commendable. And then, of course, as you probably know, we have a witness and victims protection law in Sri Lanka, not specifically dealing with victims of terror, but they do get encompassed within that legislation. We have an Office of Reparations, we have an Office of the Missing Persons, and we are seriously grappling with these issues at the moment. And I'm fairly sure that this model law that UNOCT and UNODC has come up with now would make a life much more comfortable, because you have a basic document to work on. Just one little thing I wish to make. Professor Ben Sol, in his observations, did make a comment amongst others, which were very valid. He said, communities can also be compensated. Now, I was just wondering, in this definition of victim, if communities that go to make up a nation can be compensated, surely isn't it logical that there must be some reparations even for those nations and states who have been completely destroyed by terrorism? In other words, where is the reparation, I ask, for gross acts of terror? For example, in Sri Lanka, they bombed the central bank. But I mean, it costs us millions and millions of dollars to put that back. Now, that's public funds. Now, I think it is time, because it's not easy to build back better, if I was to use that expression that we so generously use these days, build back better when everything gets destroyed, particularly for developing nations. So in other words, this aspect of reparations, I say, cannot be confined only to victims per se individually, or perhaps even communities, but even states that have come crashing down as a result of the acts of terror, I believe must also have some mechanism by which they can compensate themselves and perhaps build back better. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you, Excellency. And I'm now going to turn, given the prescience of time, to His Excellency Mr. Mudir Bouden, who joined us from Algeria, and I know had difficulties joining. So I'm turning the microphone over to you, Mr. Bouden.
My pleasure to join you to participate in this event. I salute your efforts during the previous meetings. Algeria is committed through its constitutions, through its institutions, rather, to guarantee the success of these talks so that we can address all the needs of victims of terrorism. Algeria is always ready to share its experience with all our partners when it comes to countering terrorism. Algeria has suffered from terrorism. Thousands of people fell victim as a result of terrorist acts in Algeria. Algeria has faced many challenges to compensate for these victims and their families. We supported them, we accompanied them. The victims of terrorism were a top priority. We put in place laws and decrees as a result of our national reconciliation process to guarantee compensation for victims and their reintegration in society, starting with a recognition of their suffering and providing them with psychological care. These procedures, we focused on them in previous meetings. We also showed solidarity with the victims of terrorism as a result of their sacrifice. We also paid special attention to this topic. It was an ethical obligation to support those who are victims of terrorism wherever it takes place. We need to counter terrorism and to eradicate all its forms and manifestations. We need to provide support to the victims of terrorism. The model legislative revisions should be a basis for all countries. They should realistically reflect the needs of victims of terrorism. Algeria has suffered greatly from terrorism. We will share all our experiences in this regard with the IPU, the United Nations. I thank you.
Apologies, we had some difficulties in the beginning. Our last intervention from the floor due to time is given to His Excellency Mr. Nasir Fak of the mission of Afghanistan to the United Nations. Thank you for your intervention. Please go ahead, and then we will wrap for the day. Nasir, are you with us? So we'll move on if we're unable to have I have Mr. Shirhan Khalid, the policy advisor at the UK Home Office Victims of Terrorism Unit. Mr. Khalid, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you so much. And conscious of time, but I will do my best. So thank you for the introduction, and also thank you to the UNOCT and the organisers for inviting us to the event and allowing me to speak on behalf of my unit. So I'm a policy advisor at the Victims of Terrorism Unit, which is based in the Home Office in the UK. And I just thought it'd be good to give you an overview of our role and what we do for victims of terrorism, and also a piece of work that we're doing similar to the model provisions that is similar in looking at how we can improve support provided to victims of terrorism. So the Victims of Terrorism Unit is a cross-government unit led by the Home Office with a sole objective to ensure effective, comprehensive and coordinated support to victims of terrorism. We don't provide a casework function ourselves for those individuals, but we focus on at a system level, coordinating efforts across government, public bodies, local authorities, and the third sector to ensure that support is provided to victims, which is effective, comprehensive, and coordinated. And in response to terrorist attacks which affect British nationals domestically and overseas, we provide those victims support to ensure they get support in a timely way. And to achieve this, we currently fund 4 service providers that provide support to those individuals, families, and affected by those terrorist attacks. And just to touch upon, which is similar to the model legislative provisions, we are doing a similar piece of work which is called our internal review, which is looking at the support package provided to victims of terrorism. So the scope of this is how UK central government considers victims of terrorism and the current support offering communications available alongside the status of those victims of terrorism. So we'll be examining all the support provided to victims through UK central government, the wider public sector and third sector partners. And the aims of this review is to identify gaps in the current provisions, providing recommendations to improve the support available, and also considering the status of victims of terrorism. So as part of that, we'll be engaging with a broad range of stakeholders, including other countries and international organizations like the UNOCT, to ensure all perspectives are obtained and the scope of the review is met. And Christina from UNOCT has kindly agreed to help in some form to, using her expertise and knowledge to connect us with attendees today and a range of countries who we'd want to speak to learn best practice and understand what other countries do. And thank you for
thank you so much. So I want to close us out firstly by acknowledging the leadership of the three bodies who've brought us here today: the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, UNODC, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and the Interparliamentary Union. The synergies of their work over the past on this piece of work, I think, have led to an extraordinary and quite exceptional outcome in these model provisions. I also want to acknowledge the two authors, Ben Saul and Jeanne Suzer, who have done such exceptional work, really focused from the beginning on the needs and the rights of victims of terrorism. I want to close us out with a quote from Virgil, and the quote, which I think is found actually at the site of the 9/11 memorial, which says, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." And I think it is to remind us that victims are not faceless, that victims of terrorism are not unconnected. Each loss is a tsunami in the experience of each individual, every family, every community, and every country. And I think what we've been reminded of today is that we have to move, and we are moving from solidarity to action. We're moving from empathy to doing. We're moving from words to implementation. And the model provision gives states the tool to move and do the work that is needed to create a human rights basis for the protection of victims' rights. And I know that the United Nations as a whole stands ready to assist in this endeavor and to walk with you as we try to do justice and to bring rights to the victims of terrorism. And so in all of this work, we thank you for joining us. We're grateful for your time, and we're grateful to all of those who've joined online today. Thank you very, very much to everyone. And with that, we close.
Recording stopped.